I'm Chris Farrell, and this is On Watch. I'm Chris Farrell. Welcome to this edition of On Watch. Our very special guest today is a friend and colleague I've known for years and worked with on a number of different topics and issues, and that is the author and columnist Diana West. Diana, as many of you hopefully know, has written a fabulous book. I consider it the most important book in the last 25 years. It is called American Betrayal. If you don't own it, you're wrong. You need to go out and get it. Mine is highly tabbed and noted. But also, more recently even than that, is a book called The Red Thread. I'll ask Diana to describe what The Red Thread's about in a second. And of course, all of her work is up on dianawest.net. So Diana, welcome to On Watch. It's so wonderful to have you with us today.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be with you, Chris.
Great. So listen, I kind of teased it a little bit in the intro when I talked about American Betrayal, which is really a hugely important book. I think it frames up so much of what we're dealing with now.
Thank you.
And it's had tremendous sales, and it's been wonderfully controversial, which is always good for book sales, any controversy. But I want to talk about The Red Thread a little bit, which is your most recent publication. Let's give our viewers a little taste of what The Red Thread is about. Can you talk about that for
Sure, happy to. Well, The Red Thread, in many ways, it's only 100 pages. It's really the son of American Betrayal in the sense that the work I did, the research I did in American Betrayal made it possible to look at what was happening to President Trump going into the election, going into the presidency, and ever since, in terms of understanding it as an ideological assault on our democracy. And indeed, the subtitle of The Red Thread is a search for ideological drivers inside the anti-Trump conspiracy. Now, I must say, I didn't know that I would find them when I started this research, but I was very keen to begin, mainly because it was so hard to understand much about the primary players here, your James Comeys, your John Brennans, and so on, at the beginning of this ordeal, because all we really knew about them were their resumes, in effect. They were, right. Many of these people are faceless bureaucrats or people who testify in fairly non-descriptive hearings and things like that about who they are and what makes them tick. So when we go back to a breaking story at the end of 2017, I believe it was, about Bruce and Nellie Orr, the Justice Department official, and his wife, who worked for Fusion GPS and was one of the people who wrote or contributed to the so-called Steele dossier. And we learned that Nellie Orr had been an academic. This kind of was a big moment for me as a journalist, just because an academic writes things, publishes things. Here was somebody I could start to examine and try to understand her mindset. Did she even have one? Would I find anything? So anyway, I started to look at Nellie Orr, a Soviet history, a Russian expert, someone who actually studied in the old Soviet Union, and discovered many writings publicly available that very quickly made me understand her as someone who could well be described as an apologist for many of Joseph Stalin's policies. That led to the murder of millions of people, let me add. So this was kind of the beginning of The Red Thread, and I developed my ideological profile of Nellie Orr, and then began to wonder what else I could find. Went on to Christopher Steele, having learned that Nellie had a CIA affiliation. Christopher Steele, in many ways, might be looked on as her opposite number, coming from British intelligence. Sure enough, before that British intelligence career began, he was known at Cambridge, where he was a student, as a confirmed socialist, as someone who had very hard left positions, worked for, at the time, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. This is the 1980s. That was well known as a Marxist front organization. As a young man, he was apparently involved, according to reporting. So anyway, you see the kind of thread I was on, the track I was on, seeing what more I could find out about these various people. And what I did learn, to jump to it's not even the conclusion, there's more to learn here, but most of these very famous names from that period, it all seems like ancient history now in a way, they all came from self-described communist, socialist, hard left backgrounds. That would include James Comey, another one, for example, described himself as a communist going back to the 1980s. John Brennan discussed himself having voted for the Communist Party in the Cold War 1970s. I mean, these are ideologically driven people. So the red thread is kind of a work in progress in the sense of trying to follow that down as the coup, as I think of it, was actually happening. So that was the genesis of the red thread, which came out last year.
You know, that it's a hugely important work. And in fact, when it came out, I remember being on a panel announcement or
the rollout.
And, you know, very powerful, very important presentation. It makes me think that Mr. Durham could probably use a copy of the red thread. Might be a helpful reference or resource for him.
I'm afraid he put it in a desk drawer.
Yeah.
That's my hunch.
So I read a column of yours not too terribly long ago, I think maybe one or two back, where you talked about Mr. Barr, the Attorney General, and Mr. Durham, and the lack of accountability. This is, you know, this really goes to, I guess, I think of you as sort of the curator of lost history.
Oh dear.
Of things that are erased,
Yeah.
things that we're psychologically conditioned to ignore.
Yeah.
You know, false narratives that are just repeated over and over again, and everyone sort of blindly nods and agrees.
Sure.
They have no idea how wrong they are, or
Yeah.
how misinformed or uninformed they are. That's why both American Betrayal and the Red Thread are so important, because you go in and you have this sort of archaeological, anthropological, historical analysis where you resurrect all these things and say, wait a minute, folks, this is not true. Here's the real facts. And you have such a great way of forcing people to acknowledge how they've bought into a lot of false narratives, a lot of phony stuff. And so I'm reading your piece on Attorney General Barr and the ever-shifting timeline of when things will get done. And Mr. Durham, talk a little bit about that particular column and why it's so important.
Well, thank you for your kind words. Well, I've been watching William Barr, since the moment he emerged as President Trump's nominee for Attorney General, with disdain to be proved wrong. But as to that particular column, it was more checking in on what I'm afraid is coming to bear. This is one I'm not hoping to be proved correct on, but the moving goalpost is something I don't think any of us can ignore at this point. And you, more than anyone else, know exactly what I'm talking about in terms of this complete freeze on all the documents, all of the proofs of what was going on in terms of this very wide-ranging government conspiracy, political conspiracy against President Trump. And what we've seen is this lockdown, to use an overused and unfortunate term regarding coronavirus, but this lockdown on documents, on the flow of information related to the Trump-Russia scandal, the probe, it is now called, that must constantly be adhered to until we actually get to a point where Durham makes some kind of report or recommendation as to what happens next. And this process has essentially frozen the story, kept it from the American people. And what you have to start to wonder, or more than wonder, is why it's taking so long. I mean, I think you and I, certainly you and your colleagues, could actually assemble the briefs against numerous figures in the anti-Trump conspiracy and present the evidence at a grand jury and get indictments. I mean, that's my opinion here. There's so much out there that Judicial Watch has actually been able to pry loose. And we're looking at this slow walk to oblivion is what I see of this Durham investigation. And indeed, Attorney General Barr, in a very recent interview with Maria Bartiromo, actually slipped in there that not only we started out with Durham supposed to be ponying up by spring, late spring, early summer. Now he's talking about late summer, but he slipped in there that an election would not stop the investigation. He said that. So an election that takes place in November will not stop this investigation, which suggests to me that he is laying the groundwork for the Durham investigation to continue. And then he actually said, however, what happens then depends on who wins that election. So I interpreted that as a very concerning statement from the Attorney General that we may never actually see anything of relevance coming from this long, interminable investigation, which would make the Durham investigation essentially a coda to the entire anti-Trump conspiracy.
Yeah, I mean, you've articulated my concerns, my apprehensions very well. You know, on any number of different interviews or radio shows, et cetera, or even other speaking opportunities, people for months, and this is even pre-pandemic world, people for months have always said to me, well, what's going to happen? As though I have some special insight. And I mean, I have my instincts and I have experience, but I don't know what's going to happen. And I've said, well, it really all rests on Attorney General Barr and on Mr. Durham's shoulders. It's up to them. And I've always said that hopefully. But frankly, over time, I'm sliding further and further into your camp of saying, you know, it's interesting how when the left wishes to bring an indictment and put someone on trial, it happens with lightning speed, right? Court cases move along and everyone's and in this case, on the other side of the spectrum, it's glacial, right? It's a very slow, tedious process. And you wonder, why is there a difference in sort of the sense of urgency or the vigor of the prosecution? I have a hard time explaining it. And I don't think it's about being thorough.
No, it has nothing to do with being. I think it's important to know, and this is something that the late, great columnist William Safire wrote about. He was a critic of William Barr, who, as you know, is extremely young Attorney General for George H.W. Bush. Yeah. And William Safire, looking at numerous scandals of the day, including Iran-Contra, pre-Iran-Contra, this would have been, I forget which gate it was, but it had to do with the run-up to the Iraq War. William Safire watched Attorney General Barr the first time around not do anything either, and actually dubbed him the cover-up general.
Huh.
So he has a history of essentially working to prevent exposure, which, as I think you and I would agree, is the work of the swamp. The swamp lives and dies on secrecy, on maintaining its secrets, and preventing light and draining, certainly, from ever occurring. And I'm afraid my hunch, my unfortunate hunch at the very beginning of Barr's tenure for Donald Trump was that we would see a repeat of that tenure from the Bush days. But think also to his role pre-Attorney General. He has even acknowledged he had a relationship with the CIA as a liaison to Capitol Hill, I believe. Others have written about him as being big part of the training of Contra pilots, things that were going on in Arkansas, the Mena, Arkansas operation. I mean, this is kind of where he comes up again as a very young man, undoubtedly a brilliant man, to be so young and so powerful. But I think these are his roots. He was a George Herbert Walker Bush appointee. Such a person has no place in a Donald Trump America First administration. George H.W. Bush was well known for, I actually once did a count. There was a website on presidential speeches that you used to be able to literally count terms. They changed the function, unfortunately, and I didn't write it down. Numerous mentions of the New World Order. George H. Herbert Walker Bush, as opposed 41, was deeply committed to the New World Order, to this globalist project. So an appointee from that administration has no place in an America First Trump administration. And I think that has always been my concern about Barr, regardless of the details of his earlier career in public. He sort of disappeared from the public view, as far as I could tell. I tried to find him in intervening years because I was very interested in that that Contra Arkansas issue for some time, and I could not find him. He wasn't hiding or anything, but he just wasn't a public person. And then he pops up as Trump's appointee in, what was it, early 2019, I believe, and it just hurt. It just hurt. It was once again a personnel disaster in the making. That was my opinion, and I'm afraid it's only been borne out because we've seen nothing but a lot of, fancy Federalist dinner speeches from Attorney General Barr, and a lot of slow walking of the most important law enforcement issue in his agenda, which is this incredible effort to subvert our democracy. Nothing. Crickets.
And of course, Barr's subordinate, some would argue his chief subordinate, in the director of the FBI, Christopher Wray, there's a man dedicated to damage control,
Yes,
and institutional preservation. The FBI has been handed some stunning rebukes about real criminality in their conduct. Individual blame and wrongdoing and culpability, but institutional rot. I mean, real problems. And you get, letters and press releases from him talking about, mistakes were made, right? Passive voice generalizations, and instances where there really needs to be. I talk about reform. I mean, I've advocated for the dissolution of the FBI for some time now, but
yes.
Christopher Wray is running around as Barr's executive action arm, very, furiously and scrupulously doing nothing.
Right. Well, it's this notion of running out the clock, I think, is pretty apt. It's certainly not doing the people's business. It is about institutional preservation, which again is the swamp's motto in terms of how it survives, how it exists. And it's so long as there is no echo or no reaction in, fake news, which of course there is none, it's very hard to make it seem real to people. I think there's this sense of a vacuum that just allows them to ignore everything and survive everything.
So completely consistent with that, holding on to that theme, but changing gears a little bit, it's my proposition that we are currently facing an insurrection in the country. It's coming from a couple of different angles, a couple of different approaches. One is sort of a passive psychological conditioning and sort of a mentality, almost like a huge information operation or sort of active measures campaign with respect to controlling the public's access to facilities, its travel, its interaction, its approach to healthcare. And of course, that has everything to do with the pandemic. And let me say at the outset, I accept that COVID-19 is a serious medical condition. I'm not pretending it isn't. I'm just questioning how localities, different places deal with it and their flexibility, and then the federal government approach. It's more of a healthcare management questioning. I'm not a denier. I'm not someone who says there is no disease. There certainly is, but there's a question of how to deal with it. So there's that level. And then there's a real insurrection. There is street violence and organized mobs and the destruction of property, and lives are lost. And that has to do with the activities of organizations such as Black Lives Matter and its various affiliates, as well as Antifa organizations and their affiliates, because there's been a lot of street violence and a lot of acting out and protesting, some peaceful, but there's been an awful lot of stuff where there's been windows broken and buildings burned and statues going down.
Yeah.
So, and it's widespread. This is not one city having a bad time like Baltimore a couple of years back. This is in many places across the country. So, this insurrection, I think, is something that I don't think it happens spontaneously. Do you?
No, of course not. I don't. Again, I would preface our discussion by noting that we've been watching this creep up on us, even in the Barr years under President Trump, where we've seen Antifa seizing the streets of the Pacific Northwest cities, let's say, or we can think about the protests at Berkeley, for example, a little earlier than that, where you never saw the Justice Department under President Trump's watch talk about the civil rights being violated of people who are not allowed peaceful assembly, who are threatened, who have no free speech because of these Antifa thugs in the streets. I mean, this never was where I think it was appropriate to federalize such a matter. I mean, this was something that was not on the radar. So if you can't have peaceful assembly, you can't have a political process. So if we fast forward to the last few months, and we start to see how that has really metastasized in so many cities to a point where our cities are covered in plywood and gates and Jersey walls, and our monuments are defaced and burned and destroyed. I mean, we are at a it's gone warp speed to a point where it is a terrifying prospect to show your support for the president, to put a bumper sticker on your safely through many of American cities. I mean, this is not a free country where political opposition or support cannot be peacefully shown without the expectation of having your car damaged or worse in that little instance, but also not being able to participate in public life without threat of violence. And I would note that I think it was very recently, Nancy Pelosi was asked about the statues, many George Washington, Columbus, and so on, including Confederate statues and other monuments, have been defaced and destroyed. And she actually said she doesn't care about statues and that people will do what they do. In other words, she just identified with the mob, that the leading Democrat in the country, identifies with the mob, supports the mob. I mean, this is a terrifying state of affairs when one of the main political parties is on the side of the people in the streets. And I think we can say that with great assurance, having watched events unfold. As to whether it was spontaneous, no, of course not. These kinds of things cannot be spontaneous. I mean, it's very difficult to set up our conference call just in terms of arranging everything and getting a time and think about in terms of coordinating multiple cities and national events. I mean, these things take coordination. We know that. But we know these groups have been in business for many years and have forebears in earlier generations who had similar groups. There is a continuity here. I was really struck, and I haven't been able to do great amounts of research into it, but in the connection between Patrisse Cullors, one of the co-founders of Black Lives Matters, the one who did attract some notoriety to her claim that she was a trained Marxist. She said this in an interview not long ago.
And let's pause there.
Oh, yes. Think about it.
There's video of her.
Yes.
In her own words.
Yes.
Unsolicited. I mean, she offers this as part of sort of a longer explanation. She's asked about A, and she's already over at B, C, D, and she goes, oh, and by the way, I know what I'm doing. I'm a trained Marxist.
Right.
I mean, he adds that as sort of a credential or as a verification of her commitment to what she's doing.
Absolutely.
So she offers that freely on video. It's pretty stunning stuff.
It is stunning stuff. And if you back up her interview a little, she's actually addressing in a solicitous manner a comment from a man, I believe, still in prison, but certainly someone who is associated with one of the Black Liberation Army type factions going back to the 1970s. So this sort of brings in her continuity with that past. And Trevor Loudon has reported that one of her mentors was a man named Eric Mann, who himself goes back to the violence of the 1970s, involved in the Students for Democratic Society, which splintered off into the Weather Underground.
Right.
Very famous.
And they're bombers, right? These are not people walking around with signs saying peace, love, and understanding. These are people that engaged in violent criminal acts. So Diana, these people, the Weather Underground, they're not sort of innocent protesters who are marching around with candles and with banners. They engaged in violent criminal acts.
Yes, revolutionary acts. Their purpose was to bring down the country. They were responsible for numerous bombings. They were responsible for shootings, deaths. I mean, they are a criminal organization, and they also had affiliations with our foreign adversaries. They went to Cuba. They had dealings behind the Iron Curtain in the Eastern Bloc with North Vietnamese. We were at war at the time in Vietnam. This is that era. looking at the progeny, because I do consider it a direct line to Antifa and Black Lives Matter, they too have foreign associations. We know from Ed Klein's, one of his recent books, he got from the FBI, or an FBI source, that investigations into Antifa visits to Germany to discuss matters with various Islamic jihad type factions, ISIS and so on, took place and were reported on by the FBI and actually delivered to the director at the time, which would have been acting director McCabe. This is no joke. I mean, these sorts of foreign adversaries appear in their support as well. We know Black Lives Matter groups around Black Lives Matter. Trevor Loudon has documented their connections to various groups that are very pro-Chinese Communist Party. So none of this is purely domestic. None of this is purely spontaneous. We've got networks that are essentially the latest generation of the international effort to take down the United States, that is essentially powered by what we call globalists. We used to know them more commonly as communists, socialists, that have essentially attacked every single anti-communist leader that America has ever produced. And I include Donald Trump in that category. It's my opinion he's our most anti-communist president ever. I think his innate beliefs, including his desire to rebuild the nation state of America with borders and manufacturing and immigration control, actually even communal than Ronald Reagan, who in his day was more, I think you could fairly describe him as an internationalist with some of his agreements, NAFTA, for example, and not as keyed into some of the things that drive Donald Trump. Free trade would be something in the Reagan era. And anyway, that's being said, this is why I believe Donald Trump poses such a threat to all of these groups, and why we are seeing this kind of violence and this kind of desperation and this kind of power directed against him, ultimately against his supporters among the American people.
I think it's remarkable also that a lot of the groups that you've mentioned on the left, these militant groups, have endorsed Mr. Biden.
Yes.
And I don't see the press clamoring for
No.
Mr. Biden to reject their endorsement.
No, and that's a very good point. And that was something that I noticed. I don't remember how I came across it, but I was kind of shocked because, for example, at The Nation, a long list of former members of Students for a Democratic Society endorsed Joe Biden, and without any real press comment. This again is shocking stuff, because these were the revolutionaries back in the day. And so you start to understand that Joe Biden is, just as Nancy Pelosi is the speaker of the mob, I think we could say Joe Biden is also the candidate of the revolution. So it's a terrifying sort of unity we see here with the conventional, traditional political establishment joining forces with the most revolutionary Marxists that America has at the moment on the radar. So really important point, including in that SDS list was literally the woman whose family owned the townhouse in Manhattan where Weather Underground members were assembled on a day, I believe it was around 1970, when their bomb factory in the basement exploded and utterly destroyed that townhouse and killed at least 2 of the Weather Underground members at that moment. A couple of them fled out into hiding, including this woman who now supports Joe Biden, and a woman named Kathy Budin, who's a very famous underground revolutionary, went on to participate in the notorious Brinks robbery with other splinter groups back in about 1980, and Black Liberation Army faction type people violently robbed a Brinks truck, killed 2 policemen and a Brinks guard, went to prison, etc.
So tell us, if you would, who the current district attorney is for San Francisco and why that matters.
The current district attorney for San Francisco is a man named Chesa Budin. Chesa Budin is the son of Kathy Budin and David Gilbert. These were violent revolutionaries who splintered off from Students for Democratic Society into Weather Underground and participated with Black Liberation Army faction members in a 1980 robbery of a Brinks truck in Nyack, New York. They killed 2 policemen, local policemen. There'd never been anything like that in the area, and a Brinks guard. David Gilbert, the father, is still in prison. Kathy Budin served a number of years. I believe her sentence, oh gosh, I want to say it was commuted by, she was pardoned by Bill Clinton, was she not? No, she was.
Last day in office, wasn't it?
No, that was the Rosenberg person. I think she might have been I'm going to have to look that up.
Nonetheless,
was it Cuomo? Yeah, we'll have to look that one up. But she's out of prison now and teaching at Columbia. How's that? And her son was raised by Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dorn, the other famous revolutionaries from that period.
And of course, now he's the district attorney of San Francisco, which is
yes.
So, we look at all this that we're facing, and what disturbs me is I'm not interested in necessarily, attacking those persons who hold those beliefs. It's not a knock them down or discredit them thing. They're free to believe whatever they wish to believe, so long as they're not violent against either persons or property. Yeah. If they want to march around and have rallies, great, have at it. Don't destroy property, don't harm people. That's where my line is. But what I don't see, there's a thundering silence, from my perception, of who's offering an alternative.
Yeah.
I don't mean this in the sense of physically, of course, but where's the counter? Where is the alternative argument? Where is well, that's fine, you believe that, we believe this.
Yes.
Where is the leadership? Where is the effort? Where is the spark of decision and work and effort to offer an alternative to what Antifa and those on the left are demanding?
Right. Well, law and order would actually be a welcome addition to the dynamic. But I would say there again, I was quite impressed and deeply grateful, as a matter of fact, to President Trump on the occasion of his July 3rd speech at Mount Rushmore, because I felt like that was the first articulation of this stance you're talking about. He essentially reintroduced America to our greatest presidents, to the reasons that we are Americans, to the what we find self-evident, our beliefs, our reasons of, and our essentially our manner, our tradition of political discourse as a democratic republic. I mean, this has been missing everywhere, and it's missing ever since. I mean, he sort of held the light up, and I'm waiting for more Republicans to come forward. Republicans being essentially at this point the only possible law and order party, as we see Speaker Pelosi throwing in with the mob and all the rest of it. So yes, there is there's a vacuum, and it's very frightening. I would say that the Republicans, just as the Democrats, are creatures of their time. They too have been conditioned. I mean, all Americans have been conditioned for generations in our education system, let alone our culture and our pop culture and our literary culture and our political culture and our religious institutions, essentially to accept Marxist dogma in every fashion, and also to accept emotionalism over reason, over law, to really absolutely subvert ourselves, to turn against ourselves, and this kind of hatred that we've been taught generation after generation now, we are finally seeing the fruits of as people go kinetic. And it's a very dangerous moment, because again, you say, where is the counterbalance? We're not seeing it. We are heading toward an election, but know that that election is the object of this war. They do not want an election. They certainly don't want a fair and square election. Correct. And they want to be able to seize power. You know, It's one thing, as you say, to protest or to mobilize, but many of these people are dedicated to going outside the system in their whole manner of protest. I mean, think about what we're looking at. We're looking at protests that have ruined, well, riots that have ruined American cities, sparked by a case of police brutality, it certainly seems, that has been addressed by the system. The officer involved is in prison. He has been charged. He is awaiting trial. We're not getting many details. There's no reporting here, but that is the way the system is supposed to work. Given that, there is no actual reason for any such protests, which of course are simply a trigger. They're simply a pretext for this organized effort. If it hadn't been in Minneapolis, it would have been somewhere else. We've seen dress rehearsals here with different incidents that were essentially hoaxes. I mean, this is sort of the first one we've watched where many Americans would say that was awful, that shouldn't happen. We'd like to see this police officer brought to justice. They've been trying this out. We can look at the Trayvon Martin case. We can look at other cases, Michael Brown, cases that did not pan out the way the media told us they would, the way Black Lives Matter interpreted them. And this one essentially is the show. You know, this is the one that they've taken to the limit and found such, I think the worst part about it is the support and enablement for this kind of lawlessness on the part of mainly Democratic mayors, governors that we've seen across the country that are simply throwing in with them and not even pretending to have any kind of civic duty to all citizens and also to the rule of law in their own cities. And yet now I'm starting to see, I'm sure you're noticing, cries for federal money to rebuild these destroyed cities, such as Minneapolis.
Right. And, you know, it's my impression, I could be wrong, but it's my impression that we will see an exponential increase in the sort of militant, aggressive, perhaps even violent acting out as we approach Election Day. So the closer we get to November, the tempo and the ferocity of what we've seen, in my impression, my opinion, will actually increase. And the effort is to scare people.
Yes.
Stay at home.
Fear.
Don't vote. Don't express your opinion. The only people whose opinions count are the people, you know, who have baseball bats and are tearing down statues. That's who gets to vote. Everybody else, stay home and put your mask on.
Well, there's a psychological aspect too, because it's not only don't express your opinion. What we're watching, our opinions are being deemed racist.
Right.
So our very being is being deemed racist if you are not throwing in with this mob. And so this is not just a matter of, you know, physical fear, which is a big part of it. We are being assaulted in our minds. And you know, that the psychological aspect of all of these restraints and suppressions, and I'm actually sort of thinking of the response to coronavirus as well, are very much in line with psychological torture as stipulated by Amnesty International. I mean, this is actually a very fascinating video by a very brilliant videographer named Amazing Polly is her name on YouTube. She did a fantastic video showing so many of the measures that the government has taken actually completely line up with the definitions of psychological torture, the kinds of restraints, the humiliations, the constant control. She's got a whole list of them. It's the isolation, the interruption of your routine, all these things, just restrained in your travel, all of these things, they all line up, and you do see the effect in people's psychological approach then to the next thing. What's the next thing? Our cities are on fire. Think about had the Black Lives Matter rioting and looting that we saw a few weeks ago happened while Americans were still going to work every day. I think it would have been a very different story. In fact, I don't think it would have happened, but we'd already had months of not being in our cities, of being used to being locked up inside. And so we were softened up really for this complete shutdown of our city life, of our
Yeah, I mean,
civic life.
when you've already surrendered the streets,
Yes.
it's easy to occupy them.
Yes, exactly, exactly. Well said. And that's exactly what had happened in that preceding period. So there was the psychological softening up, there was the abandonment of the streets, of the public space, and then the mob comes in. And I don't know where we are now. It's a very, there's sort of a pause at the moment in terms of the most violent aspects of what we're looking at. But the long march continues.
Yeah. Dan, I can't thank you enough. It's been a fascinating discussion. I could go on for another hour and look at all these topics with you very easily. We've been joined, and we're just wrapping up with Diana West, author and journalist, and one of my favorite works, of course, is American Betrayal. I think one of the most important books in the last 25 years by far. Also, more recently, The Red Thread, which I encourage all of you to purchase and read because it really sort of it contextualizes, in my opinion, the entire anti-Trump conspiracy. It gives you the motivation, the background. It lets you, when you sit there saying to yourself, well, why would people do this? Why would they go after Trump so vigorously and so vengefully? It answers that in large part. And of course, she writes all the time at dianawest.net. So I encourage you to go get those books and read her work. Diana, thank you again. Fascinating discussion, and I hope we can have you back on again soon.
Thank you, Chris. I enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thanks again. I'm Chris Farrell, on watch.